This is May the 28th, 1976. I am Mary B. Roberts, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Mrs. A. H. von Tunglen, Vontungelen, Mrs. Sylvia von Tunglen. She's the daughter of a father who came to Oklahoma in 1893. She was born in Oklahoma in the Cherokee Strip near Ponca City. Sylvia was a graduate of OU and taught since 1916 in the schools of Oklahoma, and during the war did other work in Tinker Air Force Base, retiring about 1969. There's a correction, please, on that date. Her retirement was in 1959. Thank you. All right, Sylvia, tell us something about your father and your mother, a little of their background, a few minutes we can spare for that, and would you mind spelling their names for us as we begin?
My father, Sylvester, Sylvester, Flitch, was a Swiss immigrant boy who arrived in America just in time to get into the Civil War. He ended in Andersonville prison, and while he was there, he met some cowboys from the southwest part of the United States, and vowed and declared that if he ever got out of that prison, that he was going to go there and learn all about handling horses and cows. We don't know how he got there, but one morning a Texas rancher found this 19-year-old boy weighing only 69 pounds, just out of Andersonville prison, unconscious by the roadside about 2 miles east of Gonzales, Texas.
Just a second, let me check this, please. Go ahead.
He took him to his ranch and nursed him back to health. And nursed him back to health and gave him his first cowboy job, which was the beginning of his training to become a cattleman. In the early days, he drove cattle across the plains of what is now the state of Oklahoma to market in Kansas City and Chicago, and they'd always stop at a certain spot to camp at night because there was a perpetual spring there. He, in 1875, was heard to remark that if this land is ever opened up to settlement, I'm going to have this spot, this sentimental spot for my farm. And so, when the Cherokee Strip was opened in 1893, he made the run on the fastest racehorse that he owned and staked that claim. He and my mother, who was a kindergarten teacher before their marriage in 1891, lived in Cedarville, Kansas, but moved to Oklahoma on the homestead. All was going well with them until 1900, when my father died of typhoid fever. Well, my parents had always made great plans for their daughter's education. There were 3 of us. Eva was 8 years old, I was 6, and my younger sister was 4 when our father died. Mother was very determined to carry out those plans, and so we lived on the farm most of our childhood days, because it was cheaper for us, and Mother would have more money to put into the college fund that she had early established. My older sister and I graduated from high school in 1913, and we thought it might be a good idea to teach a year until my younger sister graduated from high school there in Ponca City. But that mother of ours had other ideas. And one morning we came into the living room, and early one morning, and we saw her sitting at a table. She had a piece of paper in her hand, and just any number of pieces of paper all crumpled up, covering the whole table. We asked her, "What are you doing?" And she said, with a sweet victory smile on her face, she said, "We're going to do it. We're going to OU this fall. We can do it." Well, her decision was final, and that's how we happened to get to OU in the fall of 1913. We didn't have a lot of money, but Mother was a Scotch-Irish good manager, type of a manager, and every fall she'd come to Ponca and tend to the corn crop and look after our little rental houses. And you know, all the years we were at OU, we had bumper crops, and our houses were rented all the time. It just seemed like the protecting arm of God was around us throughout all those precious years. My two sisters had won scholarships in their junior year and were laboratory assistants in the biology department, and so that enabled them to stay on another year and get master's degrees. Well, as all of Mother's daughters were graduated, gradually they were on their own and led their own lives. Eva taught science in Guthrie until she married Henry Carroll, also a graduate of OU in 1921, and they went to Denver to live. He was Denver, Colorado. Oh. He was a history teacher in the East Denver High School. They have two.
Rest your hand.
They have two sons and a daughter. I'm their second daughter, and I taught school 5 years. And my husband was in war service in World War I, and we were married after his return. Then he and I went back to Norman, went to school, and finished up his bachelor degree. Later on, he earned his master's degree. He was
Whom did you marry?
Alfred H. von Tunglen.
Okay, where were his people from?
His people were from the southwestern part of the state, originally from Germany, way back from Germany.
It sounds like that German name.
Originally from Germany.
How long had they been in the United States?
Oh, he was born over near El Reno. They'd been in the United States a generation.
They were real Oklahomans anyway.
They were real Oklahomans, and they settled. They homesteaded in Kiowa County in an early day. They were very fine family, and a whole lot of them live near El Reno now. Just the salt of the earth over there. I always admired my husband. He came back from war with a 40% permanent disability, but that didn't stop him at all. He went on with his career, his teaching profession, and was a principal of schools in Oklahoma City for 36 years before he retired. Now, because of this disability and because we had two children to educate, I went back to work, and I went back to tinker. I could make more money out there, and at that time there was a rule against husbands and wives both working in Oklahoma City. And I had supervisory positions out there for 18 years before I retired. Enjoyed it a lot, and it helped us a lot. Now we're both retired and living a happy retirement life in a high-rise apartment in downtown Oklahoma City. Now we have two children, a boy, Lloyd L., who has mechanical engineering from OU. He qualified to be a professional engineer and is now vice president of an architectural firm in charge of the engineering. He married Catherine Camp, who we're very proud of. She's a graduate of OU in fine arts, pipe organ and piano. They have two children, both of whom are graduates of OSU. Vicki is a teacher and married now and has a cute little boy. Steve is an architectural, has an architectural degree from OSU and was with Hudgens, Ball, and Thompson Architectural firm here in Oklahoma City. Both of the children have their own homes and live in Oklahoma City. Now, Audrey, the youngest, has certainly had a varied and a very interesting life.
Now this is your sister.
That's my sister, Audrey, my youngest sister, Audrey. She was always the competitive one of the group, but she was married young and had 4 children, so for a long time she was a homemaker by necessity. Soon after her husband, she married Benny Schultz. Remember I told you, she married Benny Schultz, who was later the chief engineer of OU for 43 years. After his death, she went back to school, went back to the law school, and worked out a 3-year law course. So exactly 50 years after she got her bachelor's degree, she got a Juris Doctorate at OU. And
how do you spell that name? Schultz?
S-H-U-L-T-Z. Schultz. And she surprised us all by passing the bar examination, so she's a practicing attorney. Well, in the meantime, she had a lot of apartments to manage and managing some farm property they had, and also all of this changed her immediately from just a housewife to a busy businesswoman. And she'll be 80 in October. Just no stopping her. She just won't ever retire. Well, their latest honor, however, I must tell you about. Her latest honor was being listed in this year's edition of Who's Who in American Women. Now, she and Benny had 4 children. Eva Lee, all the children are graduates and have master's degrees from OU. Eva Lee's married to Ed Holman, who is with the Dow Chemical Company. He is also chemical engineering with a master's degree from OU. And
now these are your nieces and nephews.
My nieces and nephews, and he's been on the administrative staff of Dow Chemical Company for over 25 years. They have two sons. I must say here that Audrey has 9 grandsons and 1 granddaughter.
Well, that's interesting. You have an interesting family.
Eddie's a doctor in Tampa, and he specializes in bone surgery. The younger son, Freddie, is with Dow Chemical Company. He has a chemical engineering degree, and he's with Dow Chemical Company in Texas. Now, Ruth, her second daughter, has a master's degree in mathematics from OU, and she's teaching near Philadelphia in a normal school. She married Harry Stanley, who also is from OU with a degree in chemical engineering. He also has a PhD from MIT. He is with the DuPont, has been with the DuPont people for 35 years, and very, very successful. They have 2 sons, Gene, who is also a graduate from a doctorate from Harvard, and Malcolm, who has a master's from Boston University. Now, her third daughter, Marie, has 3 children. The older one is Philip Bailey. These 3 children are from her first marriage. She's now from her first marriage to Philip Bailey. She's now married to Lewis Hatch. These 3, Lewis Hatch, Dr. Lewis Hatch.
H-A-T-C-H.
She, Phil Jr. has a doctorate degree from Purdue, and they have 3. He's married, and they have 3 adopted children from their second son. Tommy also has a doctor's degree, and he's with Dow Chemical Company, and their third child, Eva Lee, has a master's and is a teacher at Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now then, their fourth child is Benny Jr., and the interesting thing about him is that he's a graduate in chemical engineering, and he also had supervisory charge of the first stage of Saturn V when they went to the moon. and he's now working on the shuttle project.
And his name is
It's Benny Jr. Schultz.
Schultz.
S-H-U-L-T-Z. And that is, I might add one thing though, that I think it's interesting. I think my folks' great ambition to educate their children carried on.
It evidently did.
It carried on because
That's right.
50% of all of their lineal descendants have master's degrees, 25% have doctor's degree, and all but 2 of them have some sort of college degree.
Yeah. Perhaps the influence of that little mother of yours has extended far on down the line.
I think it surely gave them inspiration. I think it should.
Now, I have asked Mrs. von Tunglen to tell us something, since she was an early day student at OU. I heard her make a talk on part of that, but the time limit cut her off, and we never did hear the rest of it. So that was what caused me to call Mrs. von Tunglen and ask her if today she wouldn't give for us the thing that I heard her start but didn't finish. The early days at OU, describing for us the people, the campus, the rules, the amusements, and even a little bit of a study, if she did any while she was down there. She must have, because of her degrees.
Mary, I left out my own daughter. I must say just a word about that before we start this. She is also a graduate of OSU, and she married Robert L. Elliott, also from OSU, who's now a colonel in the Air Force. And they live, he's connected with SAC headquarters at Omaha. But the interesting thing about their life, Mary, is that they made history for our family when they adopted a whole little family of children, orphan children, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7 years age, all true brothers and sisters. And I thought that was interesting. She's busy. She's busy. Her wife to a career Air Force officer.
Okay, now we're going to go to OU. She has established one point, and that is she comes of a famous family. All right. From here now, we're going to turn the pages back to about what year, Sylvia?
About 1903. Well, even earlier. I have some information.
She's going to start a little bit back of her time in OU and tell us what she knew about OU when she got there.
That's fine. I don't know how famous our family is, but they've been hard workers and they've accomplished a lot. When Mary asked me to give these notes, I got together all the information that my mind, all the reminiscence that I could think of, all my experiences.
And Sylvia's the kind then that double checks, so you'll find this to be factual.
And I also went down to the library and did a little bit of checking down there. Of course, the Oklahoma history books tell us a whole lot. We do know that the state legislature had made plans for OU way early. In fact, it was to be established in Norman December 19th, 1890. They made plans. 2 conditions. They had to have 2 conditions, though. Cleveland County had to raise $10,000 to provide some money to build the first building, and Norman people had to furnish a campus within not too far away from Norman. Well, of course, they had just a year to meet these requirements, so they worked very, very hard. They had their election, and they got $7,200. You see, Oklahoma wasn't very well known then, so the $10,000 only brought $7,200. So they had to scamper around and get the other $2,800, and besides, they had to buy the campus. And now in July of 1891, they bought 40 acres of land that was just south and west of Norman at $37.50 an acre. $37.50. It cost them $1,500 for that first campus that we had down there. They had met all requirements, and in December, by just 5 days before their time was up, they reported that they had succeeded. And so now they have
Sylvia, it'd be
campus.
interesting there to note that yesterday I interviewed a fellow who has been doing a little research on the Norman. In fact, he has a book coming out next month on the history of Norman. And he feels that $1,500 was too much. He thinks they paid about $1,000 for that campus.
Well, I was just quoting.
That's right.
Perhaps 1,000 is right, but at least it's a lot cheaper than what
Much.
that we would pay now.
And those little things don't make any difference, but I thought it would be interesting to note that the man is so far back in history that he feels 1,500 was too
Yes.
much.
Interesting thing about it was after they got this campus, I mean bought this farmland, it was just a cotton patch is what it was.
Yeah, very
after
well.
they got that, why someone, and they were very happy over it and met requirements, and then someone said, but how in the world are we going to get into that? How are we going to reach, how are the students going to reach that campus from
Way out
downtown
there.
Oklahoma City, way out there?
Mhm.
And so they had their problems, but finally a couple of the real estate men decided that they would donate 100 feet on either side of a jackrabbit trail that went through the field, and so that led down from downtown. That led out there. It extended. It came from McFarland. What's
That's
now
from
McFarland?
downtown
Norman.
Mhm.
Downtown Norman, and extended from at that time. It extended from the McFarland Church clear down to the campus. And it was just a narrow, unpaved, narrow dirt road. And later on, though, they did put a sidewalks, and they had a bicycle path. And remember then, they didn't have cars; they had bicycles to ride. Not many of them had bicycles because they cost $150 a piece. And so they would finally they built a board sidewalk. At first, it was just a dirt road to walk on. Well, anyway, they had the campus, and they had that. Well, next thing they had to think about was president. They were thinking about building the building, and they had to go to Arkansas City to check on some engineering projects there, and they met the superintendent of schools at Arkansas City, Dr. Ross Boyd, then later became our Dr. Ross Boyd, and they were so impressed by him. He was scholastically qualified and had a lot of experience in school management, so they hired him right on the spot. So that part of it was settled. And guess how much he got? $2,400
A year.
a year. $2,400 a year. Well, he accepted, and then he had his problems. The building wasn't going to be complete. This was in 1892, July 1892, and the building wasn't going to be completed until September in 1893. So he had his problems. He went all over town. He finally rented a stone store building on Main Street in Norman. He paid $20 a month for all the classrooms that he was going to space that he was going to have for classrooms. Now he had the building, but he didn't have any teachers, so he got scouted around for teachers, and the records that I checked showed that W.N. Rice from Southwestern College in Winfield was selected the professor of ancient languages and literature, and he got $1,500 a year, which was big money then. Edwin C. DeBar, did you ever hear of Dr. DeBar?
Yes.
Well, he was one of the first ones to go down there. He became professor of chemistry and physics and biology, and he also got the $1,500. And then they were about to run out of money, so they went to Texas where prices weren't so high, and they hired S.E. Amos to teach English, history, and civics, and he only got $900, which wasn't quite fair, was it? Now, President Boyd now had the building, the teachers and everything, and then he began to think of who's going to be the students. So he got in his horse and buggy and went all over this part of the country, talking to parents and soliciting youngsters to enroll at OU. And after he got the promises of a lot of students, he thought, well, where are they going to room and board? So he goes all up and down the street. Small town, Norman wasn't very large then, and he persuades, after a door-to-door canvass, he persuades enough of them to rent their spare rooms and to set up what they then called boarding tables. And $2.50 a week, room and board, imagine. $2.50 a week, room and board. Well, the first classes opened September the 15th, 1892, in this 3 rooms of this old rock store building. The teachers had tables for desks, just old pine, rough-hewn pine tables. The children had rough chairs to sit on. They didn't have any library, no laboratory, no traditions. And as one author said, on that day, this is quoting, on that day the University of Oklahoma was merely a toddling present, a hope for the future, but without a past. And guess what? They had 57 pupils. 57 pupils. Now during the year, it increased from week to week until the year ended with 119.
There were no departments other than the academic.
No, there weren't very many. They weren't academic. I'm glad you brought that up. They found that the boys and girls were quiet, and they were sometimes quite bashful. They were just from the early settlers' homes, and we didn't have established high schools then.
They didn't know what college was.
And to have courses there like we have at the university now was just out of the question. So the first few years was purely what we call preparatory courses. You know, just
academic work.
Academic work, getting them ready for college work.
That's right.
In fact, they were down there. They had to wait 6 years before they got their first college graduates, and then they only had 2. They only had 2.
Do you remember who those were, Sylvia?
Ross Hume was one of them, and I've forgotten the other one. But just imagine all that time waiting for 2 of them. Well, the preparatory, of course, was important in Oklahoma for a long, long time. And finally, remember, they had one at Tonkawa after they stopped having it at OU. I thought was interesting thing was at the beginning of each day, Dr. DeBar would lead them in singing some hymn, and they'd have some scripture verses and a prayer, and very often they'd have out-of-town speakers. They always gave them short, breezy speeches. It wasn't anything, but I thought it was nice for them to open up with some sort of exercise. And of course they had a little organ that accompanied the singing. Now then, another thing that I thought was interesting down there was that they didn't even have a catalog until 1893. They had their first catalog. And do you mind if I read what some of their requirements were?
I think it'd be interesting.
First, they had to have a good knowledge of arithmetic through percentages, and a thorough knowledge of etymology, and ability to parse and diagram any sentence, ability to read and to interpret ordinary newspaper composition, ability to spell correctly and to write a legible hand. I'd be out there now. And then of course they had to meet all of these requirements.
Yeah.
Well, now that doesn't sound like much to us, but to them it was. It kept some of them out because some of them didn't have.
Sylvia, when I entered college, I had to furnish a character reference.
Yeah, that's right. I know we. Then you might say that the college doors is open to any young man or woman that wanted to work, and most of them did want to work, and they had that desire. Sometimes I think maybe more desire than some of our college students today, but they did have that desire. Now then, after a year or 2, and I've forgotten just how, but they had a pharmacy course, which wasn't really a college course, but it was very practical, and it attracted just a lot of students there. Now then, the first year, after that first year downtown, we had this university University Hall, the name of the first building, was ready by the fall of 1893. Now it was on the northwest corner, where the Fine Arts Hamburg Hall was later, but it was on the northwest corner. It was a 3-story and had a basement, and it was brick, and they spent $5,500 on heating and ventilating. They were very proud of that first building. It was the best heating and ventilating system that they had in any building around there. There were 22 rooms that had the old-fashioned
Now, does that still
winding.
stand? Is that the
No.
That isn't the
no,
old.
that burned long ago. Long ago. Now then, during 1893 and 1893, we had 142. Now, I got this out of statistics, and you know how statistics
yes, that's
vary.
all right.
And board and room was still $2.50 a week. It's interesting to note that tuition was free to all territorial students, but the people who were outside of the Oklahoma Territory had to pay tuition. They had to pay $8 a semester, $15 a year tuition. Isn't that interesting? Of course, all the students had to pay small fees if they took chemistry or some of those courses. But we had a library of 1,100 volumes now, which was very unusual. The expenditures, would you guess what the total expenditure was for 1894?
I wouldn't know.
A total of $7,741. That's for all their expenses, their faculty.
Running the university.
For the university, all of that. Now then, we've heard all about the bicycle path and all how they got out there. Of course, now they boarded in town. They had to walk 3/4 of them to 1 mile each time to get out to their to their classes and to walk back home again. So they had plenty of exercise, and it was walking for most of them too. I know one university alumni, when I first went down there, told me that she could still hear the plunk plunk of the heavy boots and shoes on that boardwalk. She said that it began. Told me where it began, and she said where it ended. And of course, it's now the University Boulevard, and it's a paved highway. But then it was just a narrow dirt road. She said it just seemed to her like that boardwalk was precious to her, because he said that was the only path that OU had to the outside world. Here they were sitting out in the cotton field, I believe it was, and that was their only link with the outside world. Now, in the summer of 1903, they got to see that sidewalk. That was interesting. We know that in by the time we went down there in 1913, why they had a lot of more social societies and everything like that. And
now this was before you actually went to OU.
Before I actually went, this is what the alumni people was
I
telling
had told
me.
you.
And for instance,
it's what you found already done.
What I found already done when I was there. For instance, the Oklahoma Historical Society we hear so much about was organized there in 1894. And then 1901 it was moved to Oklahoma City. First, remember, it was down at the Carnegie Library, and then it was out at the state capitol. And then they were strong on oratorical societies, so they organized one real early. 1895, I believe, was the first one. And then we couldn't talk about early university or any part of university without mentioning Uncle Buck. We used to call him Uncle Buck. James S. Buchanan came to the faculty in 1895, and he stayed for, he was there. He was our first dean of the arts and science, and then he at 1923, if I remember the dates right, he was our president, acting president 1 year, and then a president 1 year, and then he was vice president from 1925 until 1930 when he died. Well, Uncle Buck was loved by everybody. He was our history. And
so you knew
civics.
him then?
Oh yes, I knew him, and I knew his wife, the girl he later married, was one of the girls when we were down there too. So we knew them real well. Now in 1896, we had a total enrollment of 148 students. 148 students, and guess how many of them were really college students? We had 5 freshmen and 5 sophomores, and all the rest of them were prep students. And we also had some in the pharmacy. Well, they were studying hard to reach college level, and they were good students, but they just hadn't arrived yet. We had a glee club in 1897. Now, I read a book on about Everett DeGollier's life, and in that book, I heard all about Professor Parrington, who was an English teacher there that DeGollier just worshipped. He was a real prized professor at OU. His teachers, even not only was good in English, a good teacher in English, but he had a way with the students.
Did you have work under him,
No,
Sylvia?
that was before. See, he was
before
back
you
in
came.
1904, I think, or something, way back.
Well, I didn't know how
heard,
long he was there.
I heard no, he wasn't there that long. But anyway, he had an influence over his students, and they all wanted to major in English. And G.B. Parker, who later became the editor-in-chief of the Scripps Hired newspaper chain, was one of his pupils. And Everett DeGollier even wanted to major in journalism, then decided on geology. But you know, DeGollier used all that training because he was quite a writer himself later on. And another thing that I just couldn't believe, because he was an English teacher, you know that he was the first one who started OU's interest in athletics, and he really was our first coach.
An English teacher was the first coach.
English was our first.
Now
coach.
that was not a regular team in the sense that.
Oh no, it wasn't a regular. It wasn't
but they
professional
started the sport.
like it is now.
They started
but they
the
had,
sport.
They practiced
That's right.
it. And they played it. He in I've forgotten I've forgotten just about what date. Anyway, they had a tennis court, and they had a little baseball diamond. They had an athletic field, and we know that that the athletic association they had an athletic association, and we know that their interest was started, and it was Parrington that started that. In fact, I think they even had tennis tournaments. It was tennis was well enough organized for that. But now then, we also know that I told you about taking 6 years to get a graduate, but after that they have more of them, and they commencement exercise. But those poor faculty people had to wait 6 years before they could wear their caps and gowns to any formal commencement. Now, if you remember by 1900, we had a lot more population in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma, a lot more areas have been opened up, and there was rumors of Oklahoma becoming a state, and Norman was in the center of the state, and that helped OU. So our enrollment just leaped. I mean, it went up real fast, and so did our budget. We now had $23,000 for our budget. So don't you see all that?
Yes,
all that helped. And we had 12 faculty members. Imagine how many we have now. We had 12. That was 1900. We in 1901 we had a total enrollment of 393. Now these are just round numbers. They give it or take. Don't you know?
Now these are territorial days. What was the status of the? Were there Indian schools, or were they still in mission schools, or were the Indians enrolled at OU?
Indians enrolled in OU. There were a lot of Indian schools, though.
Yes.
Early Indian schools, but we had Indians down there, and they were very artistic. They were wonderful students too.
Were they?
Wonderful students. Now then, our medical school started in about 1901, and we had 8 enrolled at first. And we had, for a long time, we had 2 years of
Now that
OU.
was that was in Norman, though, wasn't it?
That was in Norman, 8 in Norman. That was in connection with the
in connection,
OU.
yeah.
As for any of the medical schools.
Before it was moved to Oklahoma City.
Before it was moved to Oklahoma City. Now then, by that time, more than half of the total number, even by that time, more than half of the total number was in preparatory school. But 8 years before, all the students were in preparatory, so we were doing pretty well. The legislature increased our number of buildings and amount of money and everything from year to year. The classroom building that we now know as the old science hall was on the southwest corner of the north oval.
Well, that old administration building was one time a classroom building.
Oh, yes.
Wasn't it?
Well, yes. Well, first of all, let's go back. The University Hall, before this classroom building was completed, fire destroyed the University Hall, the first building. See, before the
so
science.
Then this
before
was
what we know
replacement.
as the old science hall was completed, and so they had to go. They had to go back to the old stone building for some of the classes, temporary, of course, and they built some temporary frame buildings around there. And when I was there in 1913, I still went to classes there.
You did?
Because they were, it seemed like they've always needed extra classroom down there at OU. I remember the windows were down low, and the sleepy students would come there and answer the roll call, and then they'd slip out the windows and crawl out and go home. I can remember that. Of course, a kid would remember that. But that was the old building. Now then, we were very proud of our library, though. I don't know whether you know it or not, but we had the first university library that Andrew Carnegie ever gave away.
At OU, at Norman?
At Norman. And Dr. Boyd was the one who got it. He
Now,
asked
what
for
year
it.
was that?
Oh, that was in, let's see, I've forgotten what year it was. It was during his, when was it? I've forgotten. I was just about
That was kind of his
It was
project.
about in the early 1900s.
Must have been.
Early 1900s. And he got $30,000, which was a lot, and that was a lot of room, more than we needed for a library then, but we needed the extra room. Now then, the extra space was very necessary. The new University Hall was located at the head of the oval, facing north. Now that was where the administration building is now. That was where the new University Hall was built, and we no longer had a University Hall on the northwest corner. Now then, we do know that OU was the first university to offer petroleum geology. And of course, Oklahoma, that's important for Oklahoma, an oil state. And Professor Gould was very popular, and that petroleum engineering became a very important part of OU. We do know that as early as 1904, we began to emphasize athletics. And we then had a football field where we could play games, competitive games. And we'd play with Weatherford and different small schools around. We were in the Southwestern Athletic Conference and Intercollegiate Conference. And it had a stand that seated 500. Now, it's quite different from the stadium that we have down there, setup we have down there now. We do know that in 1905 they had invitations to the first annual interscholastic meet, and they were sent to all the high schools, and you know what, we've heard all about that. Had 10 to 12 high schools compete, though, so we didn't have any high schools in Oklahoma even at that date. You've all heard of Benny Owen.
Yes.
He came to OU in 1905.
He's still alive.
And he was known as one of the best football players in his collegiate days, and also best football coach, and he was a good football coach.
And he held Olympic honors in racing.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. First season that he coached football down there, he got $500. And then they put him on the faculty in the physical ed department, and he coached football. And of course, he got a lot more money after that. But for over 20 years, his teams were in the upper brackets in the number of games won. And he had all victorious teams in 1911 and 15 and 1917. And did you know that Mr. von Tunglen's younger brother, was on the 1907 fullback on the 1917?
Yeah, I didn't know that.
He was a very, very wonderful coach. And the Owen Field was named after Benny Owen. Now then, in the early 1900s, the football fever down at OU was just about as prevalent as it was up down there in the 50s and in the 70s. And when our teams would return from with victories, why, they'd meet the students down the train, and they'd pull the football players off of the train and drag them down the steps and put them in open wagons and parade all over town with them, and then they'd take them out to the field.
This will be continued on the other side of the tape. Would you please change the tape? Thank you. 13, you showed up there at OU. You've given us an excellent resume of what you found there, what had gone before in 1913. Suppose we talk just a little bit about the social life that you found at OU when you went there, and then let's continue with your experiences in OU.
The social life when I was there was quite different from what it was in those early days, because they didn't have they just rode bicycles and walked most everywhere, and all their social activities were far from being organized. They'd walk to the river on picnics and things like that. Now and sometimes they'd steal fruit along the way and get by with it, but it was far different from what it was when I was down there, because they began to have a lot of sororities when I was there, and a lot of fraternity life, and a lot of departmental organizations and professional groups and things of that kind.
I believe you said one exercise they had was in picking cotton to...
Yeah, they were so interested in football, they'd go out, there was a lot of cotton around Norman, they'd all go out and pick cotton Saturday morning so they'd have money to buy tickets to go to the football game that afternoon. I thought that was interesting. I think it's interesting to know that by the time I was there, I heard that the School of Engineering had grown out of applied sciences they'd had in the earlier years there. Yeah. And also the School of Pharmacy, and also the all of those professional schools that we have, geology and all of those, had grown out of the applied sciences they had in the early days.
And they had these in 1913?
In 1913, we had School of Engineering and all that. We had everything in 1913. Well, we had before 1913, but we had buildings for everything. When I was down there, the law school building was just finished. Of course, now it's interesting, David R. McCown gives an interesting account of how Dean Manette had to get to OU and how the law was started. Did you know that Dean Manette started with having a few pupils? I think it was 45 pupils in all the efforts they made. 45 is all they could get, and their classes was in the museum. They just moved back the benches and everything, tables and everything, and had a temporary law school there, and the owls, stuffed owls, and everything.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. One day they had a discussion. Now there were two law professors, and the 45 students. They decided they were going to have a symbol, and they were having all kinds of fussy names for it and everything. Finally, one of them says, "Well, we're sitting right here by stuffed owls," and said, in Greek mythology, the owl's a wise old bird. Says, why wouldn't the owl be a good symbol for us? And that's how the owl happened to be in statuettes in each end of the law building now, and it's remained their symbol throughout all the years, and that's where they got it in those first years. Dean Manette had a terrible time, because when he had heard about, of course, in the meantime, politics had taken Dr. Ross Boyd out, and they had Dr. Evans there, and he wasn't good at all. And he had heard about all this politics down here in Oklahoma, so he laid out in black and white what he would and would not do, don't you know, and was very stern with it. First of all, the State Bar Association in Oklahoma City had decided on having the law course, and Evans wasn't interested in that at all, because it wasn't asked about it, so he felt snubbed, and Dean Manette had to fight his own battles. They first wanted it in Oklahoma City, and then when he got that battle won, they wanted it not on the campus, but down in downtown Norman. He had to fight that battle, and finally he got it on the campus. Of course, you know, Dean Manette and his law school is history, wonderful history down there. I don't know whether you know it or not, but Dean Manette was our acting president. After in a few years they fired Dr. Evans, and Dean Manette was our acting president until they got a new president. And that new president was had just come in shortly before we were down there, Dr. Brooks. And Dr. Brooks was from Boston University. He had been superintendent of schools there, and he also had a degree from Colby, a doctorate degree from Colby. But most of his experience that was to his benefit in that OU was from his Boston experience. Dr. Brooks is a man of action. He just go after things, and before he got down there, he had a lot of things planned. I don't know, he was just determined that he was going to have things done. He fairly camped with that legislature to get money for what he wanted. You know, it was so hard to get money those days from him. Dr. Brooks was good at that. He asked for $175,000 in 1912, and he got it. And do you know what the increase was? By the time he left in 1923, it was over $1 million that he asked for, and he got. Of course, he enlarged the library. He did things for the pupils. First of all, he enlarged the library, and he spent a lot in group organizations, and he set up the medical service for the students, you know, student aid and things of that kind. And he would get the very finest teachers he could, and the teachers that had been so faithful and reliable in all those years, he wouldn't fire them, but he did give them leave of absence so they could go and get more training. So that gave him an extraordinarily strong faculty, and we benefited by that when we were down there. Our faculty was just wonderful down there. The law building, in the meantime, Dr. Dean Manette had gotten the law building through, and it was wonderful. He was acting president when he could, in a position where he could get it, and all of that. But Dr. Brooks got a DeBar Hall and Homburg Hall and Geology Hall and an engineering building and one wing of the new library while he was
Did the students still live out in town, or were they dormitories now?
There were dormitories downtown. A few of them did, but a lot of them, most of them were down on the campus itself. Dr. Brooks got Dr. Phelan down there and got the teaching profession going, if you remember. And later on, that was made a separate school, and you got a BS in teaching or in education, instead of it being a parts of arts and science. I know that Dr. Brooks was he loved the young people. Mary, you don't have any idea unless you've been down there and go through with it like I did, how much affection he had for the young folks. He had his own family, and he had young folks at home, and we were always welcome there, just any time we wanted to. I know.
Tell us some of the instances when you were there, Sylvia. some you
Well,
recall?
I recall in 1914 and 15, Marion Brooks, his daughter, was president of the YWCA. Now, we averaged 365 members, and it was a very important organization on the field. And most of the cabinet meetings were in their home, in the president's home. And in 1915 and 1916, I took most of my training for becoming the new president right there in the president's home. And we'd have our meetings there, and I'd learn all, get on the ropes. And it was important then, too.
You were president of the YW then?
YWCA in 1915 and 1916. That was the year we had our first paid secretary, and that was Eloise Eagleton. Eloise Eagleton. We had to raise $1,200 for her, and we had all kinds of projects. But I remember the big one was when we fed the people that came to the interscholastic track meet. There, and the maintenance people would put up tables everywhere all over the big gymnasium room that we had there, and I don't know where they got the chairs, but they hadn't.
Well, how did you raise the $1,200?
Well, we raised separate. We'd sell candy and we'd do everything. But we raised most of it right at this track meet. Miss Thoburn and I came down to Oklahoma City, and we walked up and down all of Reno Avenue and asked for donations from the wholesale houses.
Up Reno?
Up Reno. That's where they were then.
It was amazing place. I know.
We asked for donations of meat and groceries and paper cups and paper plates, everything we needed, and we got most everything free. And
you really canvassed the town then.
And after we got that, then we had to prepare all the food, you see. And the faculty, we had a faculty committee that was advisory group for us, and they were wonderful. But even they, and I know all the students, never worked so hard in all their life as they did on that day getting ready. We
had a big crowd.
We had a big crowd, and I was just a poor little girl, and I never will forget Miss Sober and I taking the money down to the bank. And we went to the back room and counted all out, and we had over $800 in nickels, dimes, and quarters. Now just imagine that to a
How
poor
much
boy.
did you charge a meal?
I've forgotten. Different things. A sandwich was 10 cents,
Oh, I
or
see.
you know, different.
You had all
prices.
kinds of food.
All kinds of lunches and sandwiches and all kinds of food. No, we didn't serve a regular meal.
Yeah.
And but we earned something over $800, and that was a lot
That was
of money.
a good day's work.
That was a good day's work.
It really was.
President Brooks, though, wasn't the only one. He got around. He'd go to all the meetings, and he seemed to have an idea of where to, whom to talk to. He seemed an uncanny way of knowing a student down there that needed a little bit of encouragement. And he'd always give that encouragement. He never stayed long places because he had a lot of duties, a lot of places to go. And I remember...
He made contact with them, though.
But he made contacts with them. And his faculty did, too. We had very understanding Hadsel, Dr. Lane, and I remember Dr. Parrington that I've already talked about, and Hadsel, and we just had, as a faculty, it was just very sympathetic and very understanding.
Don't you think that just camaraderie with the students, the faculty with the students, and just being interested in them, how does that compare in your mind, Sylvia, with the formal counseling that they get today, where they make a date and go in and they sit down and talk?
Well, of course, we didn't have as many students then. If we had as many students then as they have now, we might have to. I think personal, informal counseling is always better than formal counseling, if it's possible. If it's possible. But I know we had...
well, of course, at 26,000 now, it wouldn't be possible.
No, it wouldn't be possible at all.
But I was just thinking of the advantage to the student and to the person. The outcome of it, it seems to me, was part of it could be attributed to that.
It could. Very much so. They did their very best because they knew the professors were interested in it, and they were, we had some outstanding students.
Of course, the counseling service is so stressed now, you know, and it even has departments of this and that and the other, you know, that the students are referred to for various questions. If the question's one thing, they go to one counselor and so on. So it's, I suppose, the best way that they can answer the need of that many as they have now.
Well, I think it made us just like one big cooperative family,
right.
And I think that was very good. Dean Felgard did an awful lot of good down there because he was in the engineering building, and so many of the people were working their way through school, and there were a lot of people didn't have a lot of money. He was practically foster father to a lot of the boys and girls down there. I remember I don't know, he was petroleum engineering. I don't know whether before it became part of engineering building or not, but I remember we had one boy working his way through school down there, and he fell in love with Merle Newby over in the fine arts faculty. And everybody wondered what she could see in that fella. Well, it wasn't very long till they were made Mr. and Mrs. Frank Buttram, and of course you know the rest of the story. That's just one of the things I remember down there.
Were they there when you were there?
They were down there when we were there. And
tell us something about Mr. Buttram.
Frank Buttram was a quiet sort of fellow. Now he worked his way through school, but he wasn't that poor. He was industrious, and he was that type of a person, ambitious. And he did work down there, but he wasn't that poor. I mean, of course, I might have inferred, I didn't mean it that way. But he had a way of getting things done. And of course, you know, later on, he just really, a lot of the students down there that thought of him as a poor working boy then, depended on Frank Buttram for important jobs later on. Just a lot of them did.
And, well, her family was rather prominent,
and
too,
her,
wasn't it?
her father, well, she was a sister of Eric Newby, who was our registrar, you know, and they were a lovely family. They were a lovely family. But Merle, you know, was a accomplished violinist and had training abroad, and was really, you know, really up in her line of work. Now then, another thing that I remembered in connection with our life down there was Dr. Brooks would come to town to ride the Interurban to Oklahoma City, you know, and he'd always pick out some student and he would talk to him. And you know that from a president, that meant a whole lot to the student. He added a lot of fraternities and sororities, and he rather stressed the social life of OU down there at that time, which I thought was very good. He had so many of those organizations down there that he felt like the necessity of having, and they had all kinds of controls over them. They had their women's council, men's council, and they had their dean of women and dean of men and everything. But even then, they didn't control them entirely, because you remember the feuding that occurred down there between the engineers and the law students for so many years.
Still does.
Still does, but it doesn't come out in the open quite as much. Then they had the old trustee, remember the cannon?
Oh, yeah.
And one time the whole east side of the building, the windows were all shot out. And
oh, really?
And
when was that?
Well, way down in how down there.
It was?
And so they...
was it purpose or just the thing backfired?
No, it was St. Patrick's bank, you know.
Yeah.
No, I guess it was on purpose. But anyway, it made the university officials so mad that they had to hurry fast to get that cannon hidden before they was caught with it, you know. Well, Benny Schultz, my brother-in-law now, had an office in one of the shops building there. He was school electrician then, and he had an office down there, and they take up the bricks in that office and stuff the cannon down into the sand pit below those bricks, and then put the bricks back on, and no one knew where it was. For a couple of years they were able to. And then
they were afraid to show it.
And then Dr. Brooks, well, on the eve of St. Patrick's always come out, and they'd do commit some sort of mischief, you know.
Yeah.
Dr. Brooks finally just emphatically said it had to be found, and it was found, and it was dumped in the river. And that was the last of Trusty Cannon. However, it didn't keep the engineers from painting the owls emerald green one time, and to this day they don't know how in the world they ever got to the top of that building to paint it.
Well, there's still a cannon down there.
Well, it was an old one they made up. It wasn't the original.
Oh, it wasn't the original old Trusty. This is the junior.
This is one they made up of spare parts afterwards.
Yeah.
And then another thing, the lawyers thought they would put one over on the engineers, and thought maybe they'd stop all this stuff. So one day they smeared paint all over the east side of the law building, and they traced their steps on purpose. They traced their steps over to the engineering building and left paint steps all the way so they'd be sure to be found, you know, and then they carelessly hid the bucket of paint and brush in the bushes there. Of course, the engineers were blamed for it. And the circumstantial evidence was against them, and so they had to wash off all that paint there. But that I think was during, according to Benny anyway, that was my brother-in-law, that was during Dr. Bazell's term of office, and he just abolished all St. Patrick's celebrations after that.
Oh.
He just abolished, and it was years and years after before the 3 law students who perpetrated that trick would own up to it.
There.
Well, all that's interesting, you know. But,
it is. This is what we want. This is the local color of that day. what honors were given in the university at that time for students?
Well, they
to
had,
kinda
they
inspire
had an
them?
owl, they had a PF for boys, and they had an
What was
owl.
that?
That was Honor Society, Scholastic for the
Mhm.
men, and then they had an owl triangle at first, and then
And they
later,
called it what?
owl
PF?
triangle for
Oh, the
girls.
PF, yeah.
PF was for the boys,
that's
and
right.
owl triangle for the girls, and then the owl triangle went into the later went into the mortar board, and then of course in 1920 they had Phi Beta Kappa down there. My sister was Phi Beta Kappa,
Yeah.
and they had.
Well, you
that
didn't
down
miss
there.
it far on
I
that.
didn't miss it very far, but I guess I was doing too much YWCA work. Well, anyway, this activity down there was real good. Now we do know that Dr. Brooks was met up with about the same thing that Dr. Bazell later had. They got to squabbling, and they had politics come up again. And
That's too bad, isn't it?
Dr. Brooks, rather than to let it come out into the open and spoil the reputation of the university and all, had an opportunity to go to the University of Missouri, so he just quietly resigned and went to Missouri, University of Missouri. But Dr. Bazell, after 16 years, met the same fate. So politics did do that.
That's a regrettable thing, because where they interfere too much, the university can't
That's right.
reach its full potential.
In closing, Mary, I'd like to mention just a few of the accomplishments of some of the university graduates that we've had.
Yes, we want to know some of them. I was going to ask that question.
Everett de Gallier, of course, is our world-famous geologist. And G.B. Parker, as I said before, was editor-in-chief of Scripps Howard newspaper
Now, all
chain.
these were down there when you were there.
They were graduates down there, but some of them before. Parker and Everett was there before, and some of them, well, most of them down there when I was there. Robert Kerr was down there when I was there. Of course, you know, he's not only governor, but he was the father of Oklahoma National.
Tell me about him
Natural.
when he was in school.
He was just a
I knew his
common,
boys.
He just as common
I knew
as
his boys when they were in school.
Well, Kerr was just as common as an old shoe. He didn't have the money that he had later on. He wasn't poor. I don't know that he even worked his way through, but he wasn't rich like he later became. And a wonderful fellow. Mr. Vaughn, my husband, just thought a lot of him. They were real pals and just thought a lot of him. And we were out in California when he got the word of his death, and he was very grieved over it.
He followed of course, law, I guess. And
he had a law degree, but he was always interested in natural resources.
He was?
Natural resources, you know. Wood, water, and he was interested in oil too. And what else was his slogan? Wind was his slogan. He was really the father of Oklahoma Natural Resources Project. And then Lynn Riggs, you remember who wrote the words? Green Ground. He wrote the words from Claremore. I was in English class with him. And he wrote the words to for Green Rose Lilacs. And of course, you know, that was where they got the words for Oklahoma. Got the words for Oklahoma.
Yeah, not my Fair Lady.
And then a young fellow who was at one time was an orphan boy, if I remember correctly. Anyway, he is younger than I am. He wasn't down there when I am, but he is nephew of one of my good friends, and he manages the Voice of America now, and he's an OU product. Russell Black.
Russell Black.
And
is he from Oklahoma City?
He's from no, he was from Norman at that time.
Norman.
But he's a manager of the Voice of America. And then, of course, we can't leave out Carl Albert from Bug Tussle. He was, of course, is a speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Yeah.
Now, several of our governors, and
I believe the morning paper this morning had a story on him, on
coming back from England with Magna Carta.
With the gold
Magna
replica
Carta.
of them, right?
This is a continuation of the interview between Mrs. Clarence Roberts and Sylvia von Tunglen.
Of the Voice of America. And then, of course, we can't leave out Carl Albert from Bug Tussle. He was, of course, is a speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Yeah.
Now, several of our governors, and
I believe the morning paper this morning had a story on him, on
coming back from England with Magna Carta.
With the gold
Magna
replica
Carta.
of the Magna Carta.
He looked tired, but he was happy. Several of our governors, an innumerable number of our state and national legislators are OU graduates, and a great number of our students have won Rhodes Scholarships, which we're proud of, and many have become noted authors or entertainers in the entertainment world. We're proud of all of them, and a lot of
Do you have any names to give us on these?
Not offhand, I don't. I just think
Summary, yeah.
Alice Cornell was one of them from here, and from in Entertainment Out Hollywood was one of them. And we've had a lot of authors, and I don't remember all their names, but we've had a lot of authors because we've had that course being given down here
Well,
so
that
many years.
the one who was Sidney Vestal.
Yeah,
his real name
Stanley
Camel.
Vestal.
Camel.
Camel was one of them, and of course he produced a lot of it. And then we've had all kinds of leaders in petroleum and chemical engineering, and you know that's advanced the economic status of Oklahoma just a great deal.
Speaking of the literary, we interviewed Mr. Foster Harris yesterday.
Well, he was one of them. He was one of
He's
them.
also
Very
made a very.
necessary.
He and his students
Mhm.
have done a lot.
Very necessary, and that helped to produce that. And of course, we've had a lot of professors and teachers, and some of them have gone on into the ministerial work, who work among people, young people in Oklahoma, and I think that's very important. I think that's very important. But whenever I think of all these, and then there were just many, many other successful graduates of university who also made contributions. When I think of all these contributions to Oklahoma and to the United States and even to the world, makes you real proud of OU and of all the
That's
administrative officers they've had and of all the dedicated professors. It's just really a wonderful feeling you have for OU.
I think that you're exactly right on that, and I like your summary on that. I want to add a little bit in some questions now. When you were there, did you stay in the dormitory or in
Oh
town?
no, we moved down there.
Oh, I see. Your home was in there.
Mother, we didn't have money to stay in a dormitory.
Yeah.
Mother moved. We moved down there, and
Well,
mother kept
several
house
to
for us.
educate. That was why.
And she had 3 girls.
Where did you live in that?
We lived on the east side. We lived where we could get cheap rent. First it was
Right.
the east side, and we walked a mile to school all the time. And then we lived on the west side for a long, long time. And we walked great distances to school all that time. I don't know how Mother ever managed it, but she did. She had 3 girls. I know one thing that helped us. We had summer schools.
That's
And
it.
when we had summer schools, why, that
got
meant
through
that,
in 3
that meant
years.
that we got through in 3 years. Because 3 years and 3 summer schools, we got a degree. But when you think of all the after results of making that sacrifice,
That really paid
if
out.
my parents could really be alive and realize all of that,
What they've done.
what they've done, they'd be very happy over it.
Uh,
And they weren't the only ones married. A lot of parents made sacrifices.
That was
down
a common thing then. I can remember it in my school year. Sylvia, was there any religious program other than the YW on the campus? And
I meant to mention that the churches down at Norman, the churches were wonderful. You just not enough can be said about the attitude the churches had and the help that they gave. They would give us not only class instruction in religious subjects, but they'd give us a lot of receptions and parties, and they were just wonderful.
And they
I
were
don't
for the
mean-
college students.
Oh yes, for the college students alone.
There was quite an outreach, I think, for them. I know McFarland has always
Well,
had quite a.
McFarland has. First Presbyterian did, and the First Baptist down there. Those were the 3 that I think. Of course, McFarland came along after my time, but I know my daughter-in-law knows all
Well,
about McFarland.
that bequest by which it was built had not come
No,
at that time.
not. It was later when it came in. But just in general, the churches were just wonderful. Just wonderful.
How did the students respond?
Very fine.
You mean they got up on Sunday morning?
They got up on Sunday
went
morning
to-
and went to church, and we had.
Was it a requirement?
No, they just wanted to on their own. And we also had, in Presbyterian, we had Christian Endeavor that everybody, and it was almost entirely university students and young high school students. I mean, high school students from Norman. But we enjoyed that. Of course, the Baptists have, any church would have different young people's meetings.
There
But
was
they
quite
were-
a bit
they
of
were-
social life through those.
social life. Now, there were a lot of people that didn't belong to sororities and fraternities down there. Now, Dr. Brooks was very good in organizing social groups for independent students
Good.
and to take care of that, of those that didn't go there. And
Were the fraternities and sororities expensive? Very expensive?
for the money that most of them had down there, I know it was too
They were.
expensive for us. The sororities and the fraternities down there were very sociable, and they were very broad-minded, because I know everybody could tell we didn't have money. We didn't make any pretense of having money, and there were 3 of us in school. We never publicize the fact we didn't have any money, but anyone could see we didn't have much money, you know.
Yeah.
And we had invitations to all kinds of social events at sorority houses. Didn't matter down there whether you were rich or poor.
There really wasn't a
It
line
was what
then.
you were. It was what you
Mhm.
were that they. Well, the fact that I was president of the YMCA tells you something, because
Yes.
I wasn't among the richer people at all.
Well, the independents, I think at Norman have always had a pretty, they've been recognized
Mhm.
very well, I think.
Well, they've been very.
Of course, I know it's has been a strong school for national fraternities and sororities, but I also think that the independents down there have also been recognized tremendously.
Well, Mary, our son was in a fraternity when he was down there, and I never have been against fraternities or sororities if you have the money for it. He was a studious fellow, too studious, and that the training he got in social etiquette and everything in that fraternity has meant a lot for his success in later years.
I expect so.
And it filled in part of his training. We wanted him to go on.
For some students, the fraternities and sororities really help them to feel that they belong.
Yes,
And with that security, they develop their
And-
personality in a way that they might not if they didn't have this little group behind them.
I think so. I think
Now
you're
that
right.
type of a student, I would recommend the fraternity or sorority for.
Hmm. Well, that was what we felt, and we were anxious for our boy to be in a fraternity because of that very thing. Because you know
It
you
means a
can
lot
make
to them.
straight A's, but if you don't know how to get along with people and how to put the job
Right.
over, you don't go very far. And he has
That-
gone far, so you know he's
That
learned
group
a lot.
living is worth, that's worth as much as what you get out of your book sometimes.
I think so too. And in his work, particularly now, and he's very successful. We're very proud of him. But I'm not against. I'm against some of the frivolous parts of fraternity and sorority, but
The
as a
immoral
whole,
parts.
and sometimes some of them is immoral. I'm not in favor of that, but I'm not entirely against that system at all. Though I wasn't a fraternity, sorority member. I'm not at all against it. I think there's some good and some bad parts
That's
to it.
right. Do you think of any other OU people, outstanding OU people, or do you meet them as you get around, Sylvia, that were there when you were there?
Let me see. Yes,
Any
Margaret,
friendships that have carried over?
well, Margaret Archdeacon was my vice president when I was president of YWCA. You know, she later became Mrs. Paul Darrah.
Margaret Dara. Oh,
And she was
Yes.
my vice president when I was down there.
Really?
Now, I'll tell you a funny story on Paul Darrah. He was, Dr. Brooks always helped groups to finance bringing in outside speakers, and we'd have huge assembly programs. YWCA and YMCA went together, and we got Draymond Robbins from Chicago to come down. And we had 5,000 students out there to hear his talk in the assembly room. And Paul Darrow was a law student, but he pushed me ahead to do the introducing. Now, he's not bashful now, but as a boy, he was bashful. And there I, just a mere strip of a little girl, had to make the introduction.
and he was the one with the YM.
And he was the YMCA, but
President.
he was smart enough. He managed it somehow, so if you pushed that job on me. Margaret Archdeacon was she was just a wonderful worker.
Well, you must have done a good job. I can add a note to that. When my daughter was in OU in 1946 and 47, Margaret Darrow's daughter was the vice president with my daughter.
Okay.
So evidently it's a 2 or 3 generation thing that you started down there.
Well, and those things usually carry over, I think.
Yes, I believe they do.
usually carry over. Now, you take all of Audrey's children, you know, all of their grandchildren, all of her grandchildren have all made good. They've all gone to school, college, and everything. I think college work carries over, I think. I think it carries
Well,
over.
we like to think so, don't we? That we're leaving a little something.
And
that way.
in fact, all of Mother's daughters' college work carried over. So it's worth it in a lot of ways. And it's been real nice to go back and talk it over with you.
It's been fun, Sylvia. I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for this resume
anything else?
and the memories of OU. I'm sure this is going to be quite an addition to our living legends here and to the Oklahoma Historical Society in research and reference. We appreciate so much you're putting this on tape for us. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you a lot. I'm glad to do it.